Now, when it comes to the actual hosts, these terms people do get a little bit mixed up, all right? And there is actually a fourth name we often use in relation to hosts as well. But we often talk about the primary host, we talk about the alternate host, and we talk about accessory hosts, or ancillary, or collateral, or alternative hosts. A little bit confusing, I know, but it's important, as in all science, that we have very clear jargon when we're talking, otherwise we become confused, right? So the primary host, I can give you an example of this with the stripe rust pathogen. The primary host we consider to be wheat, all right? The alternate host of wheat stripe rust is actually barberry. Now, I don't know if you know this story, but up until about 5 years ago, we didn't know the alternate host of stripe rust. We thought it didn't have one. But Dr. Eugene in the USA discovered that stripe rust, has the same alternate host as stem rust, barberry. All right, so this is the alternate host, barberry.
That paper will be in that package.
Okay, and the paper that Dr. Jin published on that work will be circulated, distributed to you at the end of the course. I think the discovery of barberry as the alternate host of stripe rust is probably one of the most amazing discoveries I've seen in my career. We all thought it didn't exist. And we were all so surprised when Eugene found that and reported it. An example of an accessory host of wheat stripe rust, this is in Australia at least, is a thing called barley grass. Okay, so barley grass is a weed. I'm assuming the power's going to come back on in a minute. Barley grass is a weed that occurs in Australia. It was introduced. It's actually a grass species that belongs to the genus Hordeum. So it's related to barley, true barley, and it is susceptible to wheat stripe rust. So it's what we would call an alternative host, or an accessory host, or a collateral host. All right, so you can see that here. So often when we go out on our rust surveys, we go out looking at, with the surveillance work, and I'm sure Dave will mention this in his presentation, when we go out looking for rust in wheat crops, for example, we also look on many of the grasses we know are accessory hosts to see if the rusts are present there. Sometimes you'll see a wheat crop that is genetically resistant to stripe rust, no rust at all, but you look along the side of the paddock and you'll find stripe rust on the barley grass. So these accessory hosts can be important in giving us an indication of whether the pathogen is present, but they're also important in actually building up an inoculum that can then move into crops. So they're the three terms that we use for the different hosts of rust. The one that I haven't mentioned there is a little confusing, but we sometimes use the term common host, right? What we mean by common host is a plant that can act as a host to more than one rust species. Now in the case of barley grass, wild barley grass, it's actually a common host not just for wheat stem rust, not just for wheat stripe rust, but also we've found occasionally wheat stem rust, oat stem rust, and rye stem rust on wild barley grass. So wild barley grass is a common host for all of those four rusts. All right, now rust taxonomy. The taxonomy of the rust fungi is incredibly complex. I think we could probably say this about the taxonomy of anything. We have people who work in taxonomy and they're either one of two types of people, what we call their lumpers or their splitters, right? So taxonomists either like to take two different species and put them into one species, they're the lumpers, or they'll take one species and they'll split it up into two or more species. So taxonomy is a continually changing field. It's changing as our understanding of biology of organisms change, and the rusts certainly are quite complex in their taxonomy. Traditionally, and this is now changing, but traditionally the taxonomy of rusts has been based on the morphology of the teleospores, those black resting spores that are produced at the end of the season, and pycnia, and to a lesser extent on host identity and life cycle stages. So as an example of this, I think you would know the genus Puccinia. This is the genus to which the wheat stem rust pathogen belongs, the wheat stripe rust pathogen belongs, the wheat leaf rust pathogen belongs. Traditionally in the textbooks, the definition of a species of Puccinia is that the teliospores have 2 cells and a pedicel. All right, so that distinction is based on the morphology of the teliospore. But that's changing now. In the age of DNA sequencing, now that we're doing sequencing of genes, the taxonomy is actually changing. And there are regular revisions and name changes. The rusts used to be known up until recently as the Uridinales, right? The order Uridinales. They're now known as the order Pucciniales. So that's an example of a name change. Currently, there are 14 families of rust that are accepted, and we have about 7,800 species of rust fungi that have been described. There's the 14 different families. I'm not going to go into too much detail with this. Here's the number of species, but look at this. The Pucciniaceae, to which wheat stem rust belongs, is the big one. There are 4,900 species that have been described in this family here, the Pucciniaceae. We often think of the wheat rust as being very damaging. At the moment, in the last 3 or 4 years, the rust of coffee, this guy up here, Himalaya vestatrix, has been incredibly damaging in Central America. This is what it looks like on a coffee bush. 2 years ago in Guatemala, the government actually declared a state of emergency because of coffee rust. It was that bad. And you might think, well, why is that? Well, this is a really important crop in that part of the world. 1.7 million people work on the coffee harvest. The 2013 epidemic put 220,000 people out of work. So here's an example of a rust pathogen. It's not a wheat rust pathogen. It's a rust pathogen of coffee. Very, very damaging pathogen.